Hey team, welcome to Colbyashi Maru, the show where devs all over the world boldly face off with the most logical tools on the web. I'm Colby Fayok, your Space Jelly commander and host of today's challenge. Today we have Maksim Ivanov. Maxim is a front-end developer at Mojang and also a YouTuber who makes programming tutorials with the best thumbnails I've ever seen. So let's bring him in.
Hey everyone, I'm Maxim, as Colby said, and I work at Mojang, and what else? I mostly work with TypeScript and React, and today we're going to build a React TypeScript application to fetch Twitter threads. Actually, I wanted to do this application for a long time. Maybe I had this idea for half a year. I was just kind of lazy, and now I have a reason to implement this thing, because sometimes you see a really good thread. Someone wrote a bunch of tweets and it covers some topic really, really well. And then sometimes Twitter UI is just not very comfortable to read, or you want to save it to some text file for later. And so today we're going to build, by the way, Colby, am I sharing my screen right now?
You're not, but I was about to pull you in. Just let me give a quick intro to the show. So if you're new to Colbyashi Maru, our guest will have 1 hour to complete the challenge. Through that time, Maxime will talk out loud as he's working through that challenge. And I'll also be asking questions along the way. But if you have questions, please make sure you ask them in the chat and I'll forward them over to Maxime. So as he mentioned, he'll be building out a Twitter thread reader in React and TypeScript. If he doesn't finish that challenge, all is not lost. We'll see if he has enough time to finish that off. Otherwise, we'll chat about what the next steps would be. So now I'll pull you over to the presentation mode. And do you want to kind of talk about the tools that you'll be using today before we dive in?
Let's first show the let's first show the application. It's going to be quick, and then we can go to the tools. So I intentionally made this application very simple. If you want, we can up it a notch and make it a little bit more complex if we still have time. If not, well, we have a complete application. As Colby said, I've sent him the completed application in the link to the repo with a complete application. So here we go. This app has one input where you can paste the Twitter ID of the tweet. How do you find this tweet ID? You go to Twitter, you click on any tweet, for example, this one, you copy this ID, and then you can paste it into this application. Then you press enter. It fetches the thread if there are more messages and compiles them into one blob of text. Here you can see that it also doesn't process the HTML entities like ampersand. And we could, if we have time, fix this issue later. And we could also add images, because as far as I remember, this thread actually has a link to a video, and maybe we could embed this as well. If not, well, we at least have the tweet thread reader. So let's talk about the tech that we're going to be using. First of all, Twitter API has two licenses, or how do they call this? Two different plans. One plan is regular one, and most likely will have this one and have the same limitations as I had. If you are an institution like a university or something, then yeah, you might have the research plan. I think this is how it's called. And then you will be able to get the threads from any time. With our application, there is a little problem that we only can read the threads and we only can look up the threads that are no older than, I think, 7 days. So no older than a week. And for convenience, in the repo, right now it's in the branch Colbyashi Maru, where most of the code is removed. And by the way, if you want to repeat this challenge, you can just base your work on this repo. It doesn't have the client code, but it has the backend code, and it has all the configs, which I will go through in a moment.
And so I shared that repo in the chat for anybody who wants to hit it.
Yeah, I sent you the link. You have it, right?
Yep. I sent it over in chat.
Awesome. And this README has this tweet ID that probably will be out of date in a week, but right now it's fresh and it will be working. So another thing is when you work with Twitter API is that it won't allow coarse requests. It's not a problem when you try to fetch requests using curl, like from your terminal, or with Postman or some other tool that allows you to test APIs. You can see that I've tried a bunch of requests here and I'm getting responses. But if you try to do it in the browser, you won't be able to do this because Twitter doesn't allow any coarse for security reasons. So how can we overcome this problem? There are several solutions. One of them would be to just have a proxy server that would just take whatever we want to send to Twitter and instead receive this request, send it to Twitter, and then basically be a proxy. I don't know why to explain what the proxy is. Anyway, yeah, another solution.
I was like, good explanation.
Yeah, the proxy is something that proxies requests. Yeah. Instead, we're going to implement an API using Express.js and also TypeScript that will... Actually, I can go through the code here a little bit. So we have the server, and it has one endpoint called conversation, and then we can send an ID of this conversation. What it will do, it will fetch the first tweet, and it assumes that the ID that we send to it is the first tweet. Then it will fetch the conversation. It will filter out all the messages that are not a reply to the original poster made by poster itself. So if it's someone else replying to this conversation, it's not going to include them. We want only the tweets from the original poster. This is what we do here. We compare the in reply to user ID of the tweet to the first tweet author ID. And if it matches, then it goes to our thread. And then we send an array with the first tweet plus the thread. And you might wonder, why do we send the first tweet? It's because the conversation that we get from the Twitter API does not contain the original tweet. So conversation for Twitter API is everything but the first tweet. And we need everything. We need the whole thread, right? Everything here is wrapped into a try-catch block. If something goes wrong, and I don't really care where, I don't care about granularly handling all the errors that can happen here, I will just send the message that couldn't fetch the conversation. That's it. What is cool about using Express with written in TypeScript, Express application written in TypeScript with React application written in TypeScript, is that we can reuse the types, and this is awesome. In this case, it's a little bit of poor man's solution because, as you can see, I have one application. You might recognize some of the files here if you worked with React and TypeScript before. It's regular create React app, TypeScript template application. I just put the server inside of the src folder, so I don't have to do extra work to share the types. In real life, in real world implementation, I would most likely either publish the types of the server as a package, or actually most likely would do just that.
It's so you prefer that as opposed to like a monorepo approach, which is kind of like what you have here, right?
It's not just monorepo, it's mono app. It's even further. But yeah, monorepo is another option if you can support this, because not everywhere you can do this. A lot of times migrating to a monorepo has a lot of costs, and you win a bunch of things, but sometimes it just doesn't cover those costs. That you have to rewrite a lot of things, remake your publishing pipelines. One of the typical problems with monorepos is that, let's say you have a bunch of different servers, and how do you manage publishing them separately? Your CI pipeline will become much more complex. So monorepos have their advantages. It's a bit harder to manage. So
true.
If I wouldn't use monorepos, then I would publish a package. If I would use monorepos, it would be much easier. I would just specify in the root package JSON that there are modules and I can refer to them. So what else interesting is happening here? The starting point.
I think we could probably get the timer started, right? Do you think we should get the timer started?
I wanted to go through the tech that we're using here.
Oh, sure. Okay. No worries.
Because in the beginning, when we'll start, there will be a bunch of configurations, and I just wanted to quickly go through them. So I wanted to use Tailwind for no particular reason. I'm using Tailwind here just because I wanted to learn a little bit about this library. Most of the time I use Bootstrap at work. So I just wanted to learn something new. And because of this, and because Tailwind requires you to use PostCSS package, and I didn't want to eject my application and change the Webpack configuration there, I used Krakow. There are a bunch of different tools to do similar things, like how to change your Create React App config without ejecting it. I just used this one because it's recommended in the Tailwind documentation. Then I used NodeMon. It's a package that allows me to track the changes in the server code and restart it automatically every time it changes. And then I also have the Tailwind config. Again, it's just copied from their docs. And in the package JSON, I changed the React scripts to Krakow. That's just as Krakow documentation says. And then I have a concurrently running server and client simultaneously. That's it. We can start that timer now.
Cool. And so that Krakow, the thing that's nice about that, it's essentially providing you the ability to configure create React app without ejecting, right?
Exactly. It changes the launching scripts, and then it has its own config that where you can list things that need to work differently. I think there is more popular package. It's like Rewire, I think it's called, an alternative to Krakow. Yeah, we can, if we have time and you didn't start the timer, we can quickly Google it.
Yeah. I sent the link to Krakow in the comments though.
Create React app Rewire. Yeah, and by the way, all the links to the tools I'm using are going to be listed in the repo.
Perfect.
React App Rewired. Yeah, exactly. There is another package called React App Rewired that essentially does the same thing a little bit differently. Because a lot of people have the problem of reconfiguring that because Create React App is very opinionated. Not everyone likes this idea. And then, yeah, ejecting it also brings a bunch of problems. You will have to deal with this complex Webpack setup. And sometimes you just want to change one little thing, and then Krakow or Rewired will help you.
Cool. I think my Zoom froze for a minute, but I think we're back. But cool. I will get the timer started, and we're off.
Okay. I'm gonna waste a bunch of minutes changing the branch. Git branch. I'm now in the master. I'm gonna switch to git checkout Colbyashi. I love the reference, by the way. Super cool.
I appreciate
it. Maru probably is written differently. Okay. So in this branch, the application is probably still running, but now we should see. No, it's not running. Let's launch it. You're in dev. Okay. And we'll have the screen saying Colbyashi Maru challenge.
There we go.
Okay, we're ready to go. First thing that I want to do is to go through the, well, honestly, I have no idea where to start, where to begin. Okay, that's interesting. That's definitely a challenge now. So in our application, we will have two different screens. One to get the thread ID, and another screen to show the thread. So most obvious thing to do is to implement this logic to show one or another screen. So for now, the application will return null. We'll need some sort of state. And I think it's a good idea if our logic will be based if we have the ID or we don't have the ID. If we have the ID, then we show the thread. If we don't have the ID, we can just remove it from the state or override it with an empty string. And empty strings in JavaScript are false. And we can use this to check which view should we show. So let's create a state, const conversation ID, set conversation ID equals use state. And now we can set the default state. We need to import the use state hook from React. And one thing about TypeScript that is super cool is that you don't always have to specify the types that you're using. A lot of times you just can, or it's, oh, I have our faces covering the screen. Okay, I fixed it. So here, for example, we could explicitly say that we are using the state that is a string. And the result would be exactly the same. If we check the type of the conversation ID, it is going to be a string, but we don't really need it because if we use the default value as an empty string, then TypeScript will be smart enough to see that conversation ID getter is actually a string. That's nice. Now we can check if there is a conversation ID. Actually, let's rather check that there is no conversation ID.
Sorry, so with that, with the use state rule you were talking about TypeScript. So if you try to set that conversation ID to like an object, TypeScript will yell.
Yeah, we can actually try doing it. Set conversation ID, and it's even easier. We can try to set it to a number.
I think you're missing an O in the definition.
Set conversation. What? Ah, yeah, you're right. conversation ID. Yeah, and then we have an error, and it says argument of type number is not assignable to parameter of type set state action. Yeah, and then this type is a little bit more complex, but essentially it says that it's a state containing a string here. Yeah, and if it would be an object, we would see the same error. Now, we want to check if we don't have the conversation ID, then we return our component. For now, let's say it's going to be just a fragment, and let's say some text query thread picker. I don't know. It's going to be our component in a second, but let's just check that our logic works. Okay, now on our screen, instead of the Colbyashi Maru challenge, we see the thread picker because our conversation ID is an empty string. And as I said, if you convert it to Boolean value, it's going to be false. Now we know that this thread picker is going to be a separate component, so we can define one right now. New file, thread picker.tsx. And now I'm going to export a new component, export const thread picker, and then return. And here, let's think, what do we want to return? It's going to contain a form because we will have an input, and we'll want to switch to the thread screen or thread view only when we either press enter and submit this form or click the button and submit the form this way. So we don't want to track every change in this input. So let's define the layout, which will contain a form. Inside of this form, and I prepared, oh, sorry, what is going on with my screen? Okay, I've prepared a bunch of components just because I didn't want to repeat all those Tailwind CSS classes. Those components don't contain any logic, and this is why I put them into the components folder, and also created the index.ts so that when I import those components, I don't have to go and refer to every specific file individually. I can just use the components module and import button, layout container, or search input from any of them. So inside of my thread picker, I will need the search input. It already contains this little button, search input. Okay, it doesn't know where to get it. Let's help it a little bit. Import. Colby, do VS Code imports always work for you? Do you use VS Code, by the way?
I use VS Code, but I don't use auto imports.
Because you're a streamer, right?
No, just because I don't think I've ever set it up or thought about it too much. And I think I usually write the imports first, honestly.
Interesting. At work I actually use imports, but I don't use auto suggestions, auto imports, and hints on hover, just because it doesn't look good when you stream or record.
Yep.
Placeholder and choose thread, or let's say pick thread, and then ellipsis. Okay, what do we see in our application? We're not using the thread picker component. That's the reason.
That would help.
Yeah. Somehow VS Code is completely lost. Import.
Does it usually work well with the TSX files?
Of course it does. Yeah, it should work. Okay. When you I use keyboard. Most people who I know use mouse with VS Code. And for example, when you actually most of the people I know, they just rely on auto imports when you add the code. For me, it's a little bit feels out of control. So I use command and then dot, and then it suggests if it can fix the problem somehow. So here it just got lost somehow. Thread picker from thread picker. Okay, let's see. Actually, let's fix one problem here. My code is here, and it's better if it will be right after the application. Yeah, now it looks nice. We can pick the thread. Nothing will happen. Actually, something will happen. If you look here, you will see that the form being submitted triggers the page to get reloaded, because we actually send the GET request to the same URL where we are located right now. Let's fix this problem. We go here. We need the onSubmit handler. Let's define a function, const handle submit equals. Inside of this function, we will need to get an event, and then we'll need to call event prevent default. All right, but we have a problem. Event has the type any, and you don't want this. You don't want to have the type any in your TypeScript applications. So it's a good idea if you have tsconfig to use the strict option. It enables a bunch of other configurations. I'm not going to cover all of them here, but one of them is to not allow implicit any's. And implicit means that we didn't specify the types, and by default, TypeScript will think that it's any, and it means that it's implicit. Explicit would be to say any like this. And I would suggest to also use some sort of check to not have explicit any's either. But let's at least get rid of this problem. So how can we fix it? We can fix it by providing a specific type to this event. And it's a little bit tricky because I don't know a faster way to know what is the event type for any particular event listener. But what I do, I usually define an inline event handler, provide an event, check its type. And here we see that it's form event of the element of type HTML form element.
That's handy.
Yeah. Form event, and we'll need to import it from React. Form event, and then we provide the type argument because form event is a generic type, so it can work with a bunch of different elements. I don't see why did they do this, because in my head there is only form HTML element, but probably there are others. I'm probably just not very educated on the matter of different kinds of forms. So form element, what did it say? Let's check again. HTML form element, yeah. Another way to check what kind of elements and event types do you have at your disposal is to click on this declaration. You will go to node modules, types. Types are provided by the definitely type package, by the way. Index.dts, where all the types relevant to React are listed. And here you can see all the events that TypeScript supports, React TypeScript supports. You can see what kind of fields do they have. And you can see all the elements, HTML, div, element, for example.
And that's coming straight from the React package?
No, it's coming from a separate package called @types React. Okay. So React is written in JavaScript, but to be able to use it with TypeScript, you need to install the types package separately. If you use Create React App and you use the TypeScript template, which is done, by the way, I didn't show it because I had a bunch of things change in the application, but if you want to generate a React TypeScript application, then you run npx create React app template TypeScript. And this will generate more or less similar application to what I have right now. How do I close this thing? Probably with keyboard shortcut. Okay. HTML div element. Oh, sorry, I got a little bit derailed. I wanted to show that here you have React and you have types React. You have React scripts and you have types. What? You don't have types React script, but you have React DOM and you have types React DOM and so on. Some libraries have the DTS files included by default. Some libraries like React don't have them and you have to install them separately. Another interesting thing about DTS files, do I waste a lot of time? I'm probably overly confident about my ability.
You're just a little bit over 45 minutes left.
Okay, let's not cover this. If we have time in the end, let's talk about React and TypeScript in detail. Yeah, let's get back to the thread picker. We can remove the inline function because the only reason why we wanted it to just see the type of the event. And now we can pass the handle submit. The handle submit will prevent the default behavior. Now our page won't get reloaded, but nothing else will happen. What we want to do here is we want to receive a prop, and let's say it's going to be on thread, pick thread. Let's call it pick thread. And we're going to call this function with the value of the input. How do we track the value of this input? We will do it. We have two ways. We can provide the name to the search input. And search input, by the way, is just an input with a bunch of styles and with this SVG image, but I'm passing all the props and the ref to it. And if we have time, we can go further and make it autofocusable, and I will show how to do it if we have time. But we want to call the peak thread function and pass the value of the input. One way would be to specify the name of the input and then get it from the event target value, but then we will have a little bit of trouble resetting the value of the input because we want to clear the value from the input every time we select a new thread. So a better way to do this, and actually it's a recommended way when you work with React, is to have the data so that React would track the data and it would tell the component what is its value and track the on-change event. So here we will.
So you want to control the component, the value.
Exactly. This is control the input. It's called in React. Yes, and it's the recommended way. So let's call it just text. Set text, and it's gonna be use state empty string by default. We import the use state, and now we pick thread. After we did it, we set text to an empty value, and I think that's it. So also we want to specify a new handler, handle text. Actually, I'm not doing a very good job inventing the names here because text is a little bit abstract, doesn't say enough information, but I think it's fine for now.
That's okay. I'm not sure if you heard that beeping, but you're at 45 minutes.
Okay. So we handle text change. Here we also need to track the event. How do we check what is the event type? We check, we do it the same way as previously. On change, equal sign. You see, you got me nervous. I got butterfingers, but it's fine.
You're good, you're good.
We can do this. Let's see the event type. Form event HTML input element. No, it's not true. It's change event. So sometimes you can have an intuition of what it is. I just know that form event is a little bit abstract and we want the change event. So you cannot always trust those automatic types.
Gotcha.
So handle text change. And then we also have the value, because when you have a control input, you want both on change handler to track the value. And here you want to set text to event target value. And it should be a string because we specified the event type correctly. And now we want to specify the value of the input to be text. Now we're good to go. And we can pass the text to the pick thread function. So our app component, when it will use the thread picker, will get the selected thread ID from this component. But we have a problem here that pick thread is not really defined. It has any type implicitly. How do we fix it? We define a type for the thread picker props. Thread picker, no, that's, okay, picker props equals an object. And here we need to have pick thread. That is going to be a function that returns nothing, and it means void. And also this function needs to receive, so if we use it right now, specify the props as being thread picker props, we'll still have an error. What is wrong? Okay, I've missed the H. Yeah, we'll still have an error, but here, because we didn't say that our function accepts arguments. And it does, and the argument is, let's say just text, and it's a string. Now everything is fine, but we have an error in our app. Why? Because we didn't provide the pick thread. It's not optional. If we would make this thing optional, I don't remember how to do it with function. I think it's like this. Yeah, now it will complain that pick thread can be undefined.
So by default, with TypeScript, if you define a prop and its type, it's required.
It's required. Here we made it not required, which means that it can be undefined. So we can specify it like this, or undefined. That's a union type, by the way, if you need more information.
Okay.
Yeah, but more eloquent way to do this is to just use question mark, which we don't need here. We want to fix it in the app. So we want to be able to set the conversation ID. So we're going to define another handler called the conversation on thread picked. It's going to be a function that will receive the text. Yeah, text here is not very good. At least we won't have the name collision here. We're going to call set conversation ID text, and that should be it. We can now pass the pick thread function and on thread picked. Good. Now, if conversation ID, now we want to see the following. If we pass in some value, test, and then press enter, we want this thing to disappear because we're going to be rendering null. Exactly.
Success.
Yes, at least a little bit of success. Now we can think about fetching the tweets from our backend. We can go to our server, go to the server. And what we do here, we have this conversation/ID, and it will return an array of tweets. How can I show you that it's going to be an array of tweets?
So we have a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Chrono Drones asks, is there a reason that you're using constant thread picker as opposed to function thread picker?
Oh, it's just because I'm used more to arrow functions, and in React, in the way that I write React code, it wouldn't matter. I'm not referring to this. Arrow functions mostly make it a little bit less confusing about the scope of this and to what object does this inside of the function, I mean the keyword this, refer. So in my case, there is no particular reason. I could just define. Could I? Yeah, I think I could. Let's try it. I didn't do it for such a long time that now I'm like, can we define a function instead of function? Of course you can.
Yes.
Oh my God, of course you can. Function, some function.
At some point, it just becomes habit.
Exactly, it became a habit. Because before that, when we had class components, then you had to bind this to each function and just switch to arrow functions, and now I'm using them everywhere. And it has a little bit of overhead in a way that they don't have names, they're anonymous functions. You just assign the function here to a variable or to a constant, and they won't have names. And people say that it will be hard.
I didn't realize that.
Because it doesn't matter. A lot of people say, oh, but it will be harder to debug. No, it doesn't matter. It won't affect your debugging anyhow. Well, but at least I didn't have any problems. Some people might. Yeah, so for me, it's a convenient way to define my functions. I don't know. Should we try to call this function instead of this? I don't know. I think it will work. So yeah, no particular reason, just a habit. What were we doing? We wanted to render something else. We wanted to get the data from the backend, right? So in my application, I already set up the .env, which is inside gitignore, so that you don't see my Twitter credentials. But I created the .env example where I specified how do you set up this app. So you need to specify only the bearer token, and you will get it when you register your application in Twitter. And then we also have the React app server variable. And this is the syntax when you prefix your variable inside of the .env with React app, how you define environment variables for your React application. Here we specify that the URL of our server is localhost 4000.
And that's where your Express server will be served from, right?
Exactly. If you look at my Express server, you will see that the port is either the port that we specify through the environment. So for example, when we launch the server, we can say node, no, not like this, port equals 5000 space node index.node.ts index run file index.ts, for example. So here, if you don't specify anything, it will just use 4000 and launch the application on this port. Anyway, when I work with backend in my React applications, I like to separate the server communication in a separate layer. which is an API layer, so that my components have no idea that there is such thing as request, response, and backend and internet and whatnot. They should know that there is some asynchronous function that will return data or will throw an error. That's it. That's all they know. To do this, inside of my client, I'm gonna define a new file called API. It doesn't have to be one file. It might be a folder with a bunch of different functions, but as we are gonna have only one function, then I'm gonna define only one file, api.ts. Inside of this file, if we look at the server, I'm thinking how to name this function. It's gonna be get conversation. Export const get conversation.
That's a good way to approach the naming of the function. I would have named it something similar, but I never thought of it to like walk through it in that way, as opposed to, you know, like a post conversation or something.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that is important about writing your code is to be predictable as possible. So I'm trying to find some very obvious ways of doing things. Something that, and another thing that this is tied to is, if you have something, try to use one name for it. So for example, if we, or at least similar names, so you see that it's related. So this is why I did it this way. And also it saves some mental fuel. You don't have to think so as much. You just check how we request it. This function is going to receive an ID of the conversation or thread that we're going to be using. It's going to be a string. And then inside of it, we're going to use the fetch API. We're going to fetch. The URL is going to be process env react app server API server, right? It was. I don't remember.
I think that sounds right.
API server, exactly. And then we will actually put it inside of a template string with backticks, because there we need to add the conversation and then slash and then the ID. All right. Now, I also want to make this function asynchronous. I'm gonna get the response equals await fetch. Now, I will check if response awk, and it means that the status of the response was 200, and it means that we're good. We probably got the data. We can be confident enough that we got the data. Then I return await response JSON. Otherwise, if we didn't get the response, then we throw an error. Throw new error. And here you can get the message from the backend, because this way you will track the non-200, non-OK statuses. If the error will happen inside the fetch request, which to be honest will happen only if you don't have connection to your backend, you couldn't even perform the request, then it will throw automatically. And here we throw an error. We don't really care what went wrong, so I'm just gonna say something went wrong. All right, now if we go back to our app, we already have the API defined, but something needs to call this function. And I think it's convenient to separate this logic to a hook, because what we're gonna do, we will have to handle the error, loading status, and the data that we receive. And it's good to separate it into a custom hook. So let's define it. Create a new file, use conversation. .ts. From here, we export const use conversation. It's gonna receive a conversation name, and this is actually very convenient, because what we have now in React with hooks is observables and computeds. Computeds can be data oriented or effect oriented. I'm not using the proper terms here, but you probably get the idea. Because if you look at the app, we have an observable here. So every time this conversation ID will change, our app will re-render, but also if we pass it to our hook will be recalculated. So it can recalculate the data. So for example, when you use memoized values, that's another kind of computed. Or our custom hook will be effectful. It will, every time the conversation ID will change, it will perform another request, fetch the Twitter thread, and return it from the hook. So we'll receive the ID, which is going to be a string. And inside of this thing, we're going to have a bunch of states. First one is definitely going to be the isLoading. And by the way, if your application relies a lot on communication with backend, and you have to sync a lot of state with the backend, then it's a good idea to just use React Query.
I've heard a lot of great things about React Query, but I haven't actually used it yet.
Oh, I totally recommend you doing this, because what I'm doing here, I wouldn't have to do this with React Query. And also it would actually cache the request. And also it would automatically do a bunch of refetchings in a bunch of occasions. Like, for example, if you leave the page and then you return back to it, it will refetch all your queries automatically by default.
That's nice.
Kind of cool, yeah. And as you can see, I'm passing the false, but TypeScript understands that it's a Boolean. It kind of broadens the scope of the type. Because false and every literal value can be the type of its own. False can be the value, just more narrow than Boolean. So we have isLoading. We'll also need the error state. Error is going to just store the error object. Set error equals use state. Here, we don't give a chance to TypeScript to realize what kind of object is here. So I'm going to say that it's going to be an error, just regular error object. And yeah, I cannot specify the null, set it to null, because it can be either error or undefined. If I want to set it to null as well, then I need to define it as a union type, that it's error or null.
Just so you know, you have 30 minutes left.
Oh my God, I think we're good. We also can set the tweets. And tweets are going to be an array of tweet type. Tweet, it's an array of type tweet, and we import it from server types. I intentionally made it a separate file that only contains the type of the tweet object that we receive from our backend. Let's go back to use conversation. The default value here, I want it to be an empty array. I want it to never be undefined unless we have an error. Then we will have to use the use effect that will perform a side effect every time the conversation ID or the ID is going to change. So here we define a callback, and then we define an array of dependencies that will make this function, this effect, to be executed every time and only when ID is changed. Let's import the use effect from React. And now inside of it, we are going to define an async function, fetch conversations. Const fetch conversations. Conversation, not conversations. And we do it because it's not a good idea to set the callback function to be asynchronous. And to be honest, I just don't remember why. I remember that you shouldn't do this, but I don't remember what will happen if you do. So fetch conversation is going to be an async function. It doesn't need to receive any arguments. And then we immediately after we defined it, we call it fetch conversation.
If I remember correctly, I don't think you can actually even set it as an asynchronous function. Like, I think it just won't work. Yeah.
No, it will.
It will work?
But it's a... Wait, what? Oh, because it's TypeScript. Yes, here it won't work.
Mm.
Oh, yeah. Fetch conversation. What do we need to do here? So when we begin to fetch conversation, first thing we want to do, we want to set the isLoading state to true. Then we want to try, and here we can get an error. If you remember, in the API module, we defined it so that if we get a non-200, non-OK response from the backend, then we might throw an error. So this is why we're doing try. And then catch. Here we catch an error. And we set error to be error. Oh, and by the way, here we can also set.
So we have a question from Ikizio. Is it better to create an async function inside of useEffect, or use an asynchronous immediately invoked function expression, the IIFE?
I don't think it really matters. It's completely up your preference, really. So immediately invoked asynchronous function, I can show what it is. So for example, we define a function and we immediately invoke it here. And the function defined here will be async anonymous function, where we do the same logic, like await some stuff. Doesn't matter. This syntax is a little bit shorter. For me, if I would see this code or that, I would just try to kind of do exactly as other people did in the project. So if people do like this, then I will adapt to this. If people do it with immediately invoked asynchronous functions, I would do immediately invoked asynchronous functions. Doesn't matter. So if we catch an error, we set the error. And then finally, we set is loading to false. Now, what we try to do here is we want to get the tweets, I guess. We can do it shorter. Set tweets, await, get conversation ID. And we need to import this thing. What? Yeah, now it knows. You see, now it knew that it can import it from API. Okay, now we have a bunch of unused variables, and we'll just return them from our custom hook. Return is loading tweets error, and yeah, I think we're good.
The nice thing is technically you could probably export that fetch conversation function too, because you defined it, right?
Technically.
No, I don't mean in the export there. I mean like passing it in the return statement, like the variables.
You mean this thing?
Yeah, if you defined it outside of the use effect scope.
And it makes sense. For example, React Query does it for the mutations. So when you want to perform some action, not on every component mount or every time the observable changes, and you want to do it manually, for example, when user clicks something, then they also return the mutator function, as they call this. But essentially, it's this fetch conversation thing. It just wouldn't be wrapped into the use effect. So yeah, it's quite convenient. So you can use.
We also have a question. What do you think about using use callback?
I think that use callback should be used only. I'm actually planning to record a video about React optimizations, and use callback allows you to memorize the function or a callback. And to be honest, callbacks are rarely an overhead big enough to worry about memorizing them. And I remember I think more than a month ago, I posted a tweet where I actually compared. If you do, let's say we have a callback, and you do const t1 equals performance, and this is a built-in module now, and then t2 performance now, and then you define an array somewhere here, const time deltas equals an array, and then you will push the t1 and t2 on every render, and then you will then compare the average on, let's say, 1,000 renders. You will see that the difference between a function inside of the use callback and a regular function is going to be, I think, definitely more than twice, maybe actually more than 10 times. So it can help if, let's say your application is slow, you have a bunch of components and you pass a prop that for some reason this function is getting redefined, and then you're trying to fix this prop being changed while it shouldn't. Then most likely you would be able to fix it otherwise. Maybe move this function to context and use, instead of using prop drilling, or raise it up to another component, or like there are a bunch of other ways instead of using use callback. So use callback has an overhead. It actually can, not likely, but it can hinder your performance a little bit. And it also is just the wrong way to fix most of the problems. Another thing is with both use memo and use callback, you're kind of using the last resort solution, because caching should only be used when there is no other ways to fix the problem, because your React applications, most of the time, they will be fast and quick enough. If they're not quick enough, it means that somewhere you are probably doing some extra renders because some prop is being passed that is being changed and you don't want it to change. And you should look at your application structure first. And then if there is no other way, then yeah, they use Mimo wrapper for the components, and they use callback. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
That was a long rant.
No, but that was good. Yeah. Exactly. I think it's don't try to over optimize before you actually recognize that as the bottleneck, right?
Yeah, the reason is that caching just hides the problem, and then debugging something that is cached, it's so much harder, and it can lead to problems that are very hard to debug. The toughest bugs that I ever encountered during my career were because of caching, and it's not necessarily about React caching specifically, but overall, like network request caching. It's a very complex problem. Caching is hard. It's not like, let's cache everything by default. No. It's a bad idea. Okay, so here we get tweets. Error is loading. And we get it from use conversation. And we need to pass our conversation ID to it. Let's import the use conversation, or import the use conversation. Now we can handle the is loading and error states. So if I usually like to handle it before I return the regular layout, it's just nicer, like early returns style. Is loading. Then we return a paragraph that is going to just say loading. Of course, it would be nicer to use some nice loader, but we have time cap here.
Don't have that luxury.
Yeah, exactly. If you have error, then we render an error. And I know that error is going to be a regular JavaScript error object, so I'm going to use this syntax error. And then error message. That's it. What is wrong? I forgot the closing tag. If error, okay, now we can render the tweets actually. Let's do it first without any styling. Let's add a fragment, and inside of it, let's add a map through the tweets. What? Cannot find name tweet. Of course, it doesn't know that I'm defining a function. Okay. Here it already knows that the type of tweet is tweet, which will allow me to use the tweet fields. Here I return a paragraph for each tweet. Render the tweet text. And as we're mapping through the elements, I will need to provide the key property to each paragraph. Key, and each tweet, luckily, has the ID. All right. Actually, we're good to go. Something went wrong. Why?
The error state worked.
What? Tweets error is loading. What is going on? Okay, this is going to be silly, but I want to see what is going. Wait a second.
Console log is never silly.
Yeah. I know a lot of people who would say it is. I don't agree to them. It's just, it's sometimes it's not convenient to use debugger. It's just quicker. Error, something went wrong. Get conversation. So we're calling our API for some reason. Oh, I know what is going on. We didn't check that our ID is actually truthy. So we're going to do the following. If we do it here, if conversation ID, not conversation ID, no. If not ID, then just return. That's it. This should fix it. Now we see the loader. Why? is loading.
Yeah, because I think you're setting to is loading, and then you're never, because you're returning before you set it out otherwise, right?
Then we don't need to set the error here. All right. Let's try out some conversation ID. Let's copy it, go back, enter, loading. Yeah, and it's sort of kind of worked, yes. Now the only yeah, thank you. So let's drop, no, not this thing. Let's go to our app, and to make it look nicer, I actually have a container that is called thread container. And we can go through a bunch of our components in a second. Okay, now it doesn't know where to get this component. I don't understand. How does it work? Import thread container from components. All right. Okay, and the only thing left is the button that will reset the conversation. Read another thread. No luck. I don't see the logic here. Like, why does it see the API module and the type in the server module, but doesn't see components? Weird. Read another thread. And here we listen to onClick.
So you know, we have 15 minutes left.
We have plenty of time. I think we have time to definitely implement the autofocus when we just open the application. Maybe we have time to get the ID from the URL, and maybe we could even fix this ampersands. Actually, it's quite quick, but dangerous, and we will discuss it. And maybe even load the media. Let's see how much time do we have. Actually, we know how much time do we have. Let's see how much time will we need. Yeah. Handle, let's call it reset conversation. No, reset thread. Let's define a new function. Oh, I need to remove the console log. Const reset thread equals a function. We don't care what is the event here. We want to set conversation ID to an empty string. Open the conversation, read another one.
It worked.
And it seems to... Okay, it's a bit weird. It's glitching. Yeah, it shows the previous one. So we need to be able to reset the tweets. Let's create a function inside of the use conversation called reset tweets. Set tweets. Let's call it reset thread, and it will also set is loading to true. No, I don't want to do this. Okay, reset thread, and then we return it from the hook. Now inside of the app, we will get it. And call it here. Oh, name collision. Okay, let's call it reset. Okay, actually we can fix it here. It's a quick fix.
There we go.
Can we do this hackiness here?
I'm all for it.
Reset conversation. All right. Okay, and read another one.
Lovely.
Okay, good. What did you want to do? Automatically focus the input. So this is where refs will... Do you hear this noise? I live near the hospital. They probably went to help someone on a helicopter. So search input. As you can see, I'm using this forward ref wrapper here. And what it does, it allows you to use a second argument to your component. Usually you receive only the props, and usually you would also destructure them. Some prop that we might need. But here we don't restructure them because we just pass all the props that we get. We spread them to the input component. But we also get the second argument, which is a ref, which is a reference to the rendered element in the DOM, the actual HTML element. And having this ref will allow us to focus on this item automatically. Where do we use this search input? It's in the app. To do this, we're going to define an effect. It's going to fire every time we load the component. To do this, we will pass the empty array as the dependency array. Use effect, callback, an empty array. Let's import this thing. And then here, we also need to define the ref. Const input search, whatever, input ref equals use.
Naming things is hard.
Yeah. And I'm used to kind of begin to think, but now I have to stop myself because that's not the most important part here. Use ref. Here we need to specify what will be the type of our ref. It's going to be an immutable ref because we don't specify the null, but we'll get to this topic later. I think it's something interesting to discuss a little bit about mutable and immutable refs in React TypeScript. So input ref, the type is going to be HTML input element. We need to import this thing as well. The default value is going to be undefined, and it's fine. Now we need to pass the input ref to our thread picker. Ref equals input ref. Oh my God, we forgot the thread picker. The thread picker should handle it. Yeah, exactly. That's not a problem. Not a big deal.
Easy to copy paste over.
Yeah, exactly. We just need to import those things again. Ref and effect. And now we check. Actually, we don't need to check anything. We do input ref question mark current question mark focus. And we need to call the focus. And the search input will receive the ref input ref. Really, TypeScript is being overly protective here because use effect, if you use the empty array, actually use effect fires only after the component is mounted. And if it's mounted, that means that ref, okay, what now? Type undefined is not assignable. Okay, here we come to the mutable and immutable refs. Like this. Now it's immutable. Yeah, good. What I was talking about, yeah, that use effect fires after the component is mounted, and if it's mounted, that means that ref is already there. So we don't really need to perform this check. And what I'm doing here is optional chaining, and it means that if input ref is null, it will not perform the attempt to get the current key and then the focus key and then call it. It will just kind of return undefined. So it's a handy way to avoid doing if input ref.
Love optional chaining. So good.
Current. Yeah, exactly. I love it as well. I missed it so much since the times I was working with Ruby, and then finally JavaScript also has it now. Yeah, so it's kind of an alternative to this syntax. Okay, we're focusing the input now. Boom, it's focused automatically. I should actually work with my contrast levels here because it's not very accessible, but at least you see that, yeah, the cursor is blinking and I didn't click on it. That's kind of handy. We can select the tweet. Next thing to fix is, I think those amps, they don't look too good. Let's try to fix. So React is playing safe by default, and it wants to protect you from XSS vulnerabilities, so that if someone tries to inject JavaScript code in your values that you're going to render on the screen, it's not going to be possible because they will be escaped, like those entities, HTML entities like and ampersand. We can overcome it while it's not recommended, and the name of the prop actually suggests that no, you probably shouldn't do this. But yeah, we're still gonna do this. We need to go to the app, and for each paragraph, instead of passing in the tweet text, we're gonna set dangerously set inner HTML.
I don't think the two dashes are in the front of it, right?
I think there is at least one dash. Wait, let's check. Actually, we can.
I thought those dashes were on the property inside of the object.
Oh yes, I didn't. You see, I didn't use it. This is why I don't remember. Exactly because you shouldn't use it. The only time I used it was when I was implementing a translation component that needed to receive all sorts of text, and they could contain HTML and other stuff. And while doing this, instead of relying on React escaping mechanism, I had to sanitize all the strings.
Yeah, it's also pretty common to use it for like a CMS where like you're trusting that HTML coming in anyways.
Yeah, should you? If it's coming from the database, then should you?
It's a good question. I mean, yeah.
I think anything that comes from any sort of users is kind of dangerous, because if it hit the database, so somewhere some user sent it, it's hard to imagine sometimes, but I think it can end up poorly, probably. Yeah. The problem with the security issues is that the ones that will hit you are the ones that you forgot to think about or couldn't even know that they exist.
True. And the attacker could change the database even if the CMS itself doesn't.
It's not capitalized. Okay, and then we don't need to... Cool thing about React is that you don't always need to have the closing tag, right? You can just have self-closing, any tag to be self-closing, even paragraphs and divs.
That sure is dangerous.
That is dangerous, yes, but now we have proper ampersands.
Yep.
And we have a button. Okay, we still probably have like 5 minutes or something, right?
We have... So for some reason, the timer actually stopped. So I don't know. It stopped at 12 minutes. It looks like something froze.
Okay.
So I got to figure out what's up with that.
Yeah, you know what? Let's say we have... I don't know what to do.
Yeah, you want to say like under 10 minutes? How about 9 minutes? Because I'll just remove. Yeah.
I don't think we'll manage to implement the media at this time, because we'll have to dig into the API and check how to get the media, like tweet fields. Is it media? And then we request it again. No, there is no such field. We'll have to go to the docs. Let's try it anyway. It's more fun than implementing the URL, getting the ID from the URL. It's not a common feature.
So you have 9 minutes left.
Cool. Wish me luck. Wish us luck. Yeah. Tweet lookup. Where is the API reference? And then we need to tweet lookup. I think we want this thing recent. Search tweets, expansions. Media fields. Yeah.
So you're essentially trying to find the property where that media exists in that request, right?
Exactly. So when I'm sending a query to get the tweets, I'm sending parameters, that limit the response. So initially I wanted only in reply to user ID, author ID, created that, while really I'm not really interested in this one. I don't care. Conversation ID, and what was that one? Media fields. I wish they had GraphQL, to be honest.
That would be nice, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Connection reset. I hope I didn't hit the limit. No, it's fine.
Should that be a key instead of a value?
Yeah, it should be a key. I think what we want here is attachments. Text, conversation ID. Okay, are we checking the conversation that we're, what?
I wonder if the media fields should be a whole new query parameter.
Media fields probably should be. Media fields. And here we want preview image URL.
That's still not right.
We need to look up some other thread. Maybe even one message, but with image. I think Colbyashi Maru has set an image. Or for example, this one.
Perfect.
This is a preview image of us. Should be good enough. Okay, let's try this one. Let's go back to the postman. Try this conversation ID. Send.
I think it has that from in there, right? Because it's not from the right author.
Yeah, it's not from the right author, and we can get the author by fetching this tweet. And then author. Oh, your Twitter ID is kind of small. It means that you're like an old Twitter user, right?
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Okay, what's wrong here? Conversation ID. Ah, there is no conversation probably. There is only one tweet. And then we can use the same fields, tweet fields, attachments, attachments. Media keys, okay. Media fields, preview, image, URL.
I was gonna say, I have a different thread if you want to use that. I'll send it in Zoom just in case you want it.
Yeah, where do I find it in Zoom? More
Zoom chat. It's a Twitter thread that I made that has images for each one if you wanted to use it.
Yeah, it's probably, if it's old, then it won't work.
Oh, okay.
The lookup, yeah, it needs to be fresh. It needs to be like 7 days old,
gotcha.
At most. Yeah, this should be... Okay.
So you have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. Oh, it sounds like it's over. I wonder if I'm doing something wrong or if it's not an attachment, because it has media keys. It means that there is an attachment, definitely. Preview image URL. I'm probably doing it wrong. Let's look at the docs. Media fields, preview image URL. No, it's correct. Media fields. Am I missing something? Attachment media keys. Let's try adding that. Attachments media keys. Okay.
Didn't seem to like it.
Yeah, it wants attachments, conversation ID, entities, maybe entities. I don't know. Tweet fields, entities. I added space that it didn't like. mentions, URLs, all right. Display URL, expanded URL. It's probably a photo, right?
I would think so. Are we able to use the media key to look up the media?
Are we able?
So that would probably we would probably have to spend time working with the other API endpoint.
Yeah, I want the preview URL. How do I get it? Like it says that we can specify the media fields. But I wonder if the URL that we got here, for example, okay, it's unbound URL. I think this works. Images. Yep. There are two images. They probably just have different sizes. Let's see which one is this one. Okay, it's your avatar. Probably the smaller one is also your avatar, just smaller. Yeah, exactly. That's not what we want. Maybe this one, expanded URL. No. Reference tweets. It's not a photo, right? It's Twitch link that is just OG image. It's automatically generated.
Yep, I just attached it like a standard media image.
Probably that's the problem. That's why we don't see it as an image.
If you look inside of the Twitter docs back to there, I was seeing it said something about expansion. Did you try that expansion, the attachments.media key? It was right next to the media.fields property.
Expansions, attachments, media keys. Yes, I've used exactly them.
Okay.
Attachments. Wait. I didn't use. How do you mean to use them?
As a query parameter, I guess, maybe.
Like
or should that be expansions, the query parameter?
Expansions. Wait. Yeah, expansions, attachments, media keys. Yeah, I'm probably just being a little bit non-functional, non-fully functional.
It's definitely not the most straightforward thing.
Attachments, media keys. Yeah, what to put where? Kind of becomes obvious if you read this part as this column, and then that part.
That's what I'm thinking, yeah.
As that column. Attachments, media keys. Yep. Will it actually help? Will it actually help? Expanded URL, display URL, attachments. What is media key?
Good question.
Media files. Media fields. Preview image URL. No. Next token.
Yeah, we have 15 seconds left.
We won't give up. We will still try to Google it. Yeah. Media keys. That's at least. Okay, so I will read it up later.
Yeah, I think you were going over scope anyways, so you definitely got the original task done. So I applaud you for the effort. But
yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So do you want to kind of just go through and walk through what you did today?
Yeah, let's go. So we built an application that is both client and server. Server we need only because Twitter API does not support requests from different domain made from the browser. It doesn't have the course policy set up, which is done for security reasons. Two, we could overcome it having some generic server that would just proxy all the requests to and just specify the course policy that would allow every domain or ones that you specify. But we decided to make a wrapper around the Twitter API that would handle one endpoint called conversation ID, where we would fetch the conversation, and the conversation would be an array of tweets starting from the original tweet. And here we assume that the ID that we're passing to this endpoint is going to be the ID of the first tweet in the conversation. And then we fetch the conversation, and the tricky part here is that the conversation is every tweet in response in reply to this original tweet except for the first one. So we need the first one and the whole conversation where we filter out only the tweets that were the author made to their own original tweet. And then we create an array of the first tweet and the thread. If something goes wrong, we of course return an error status. Then we also have the types module here where we define the tweet status. Oh, and here's an interesting story. Actually, if we go to the README, I've linked a command here, npx OpenAPI TypeScript. Let's try to run it. What it will do, it will actually fetch the OpenAPI definition from Twitter and generate types based on it. But working with it, I realized that the types that it generates are overly complicated. So where is the twitter.ts? It will have operations, and if we check the type of the operation, tweet lookup response. This is roughly the tweet that we would get here. So data would be an array of tweets. And tweet has an ID created at all the fields, but as you can see, all of them are optional. And in our case, they're not really optional. We require them in our query, and TypeScript has no way of knowing that we fetch the data so that all the fields are not optional. It just assumes that they might be not there. So working with that would require us to use a lot of checks for all the fields to exist in the tweet. And this is just not handy. I decided to define my own type for this. Then we defined an application where we're getting what is happening? We're getting the conversation ID from the user input. We have a special thread picker that is shown only if we don't have the conversation ID. So if we have it, we show the thread container with all the tweets that we fetched. And we have this button to reset so everything revolves around the conversation ID. If we don't have it, we show the picker so we can select the conversation ID. And if we have it, then we show the list of the tweets in this conversation. What else is interesting here? We have the thread picker, and the only thing that it does is it handles the input to this input, handles the input into the input, and reset, and also automatically focuses it. So to be honest, it's not much. It's not much, but it does the job.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that you're able to show is how you can take advantage of custom hooks to kind of contain that logic and be able to maintain the state like that.
Yeah, I love custom hooks now. When they were first released, at first they were kind of felt awkward after you switch from the class components. But now I see that they're so powerful that now you don't need any sort of state management solution for React. You can do everything with hooks in much more convenient way that actually MobX provided quite similar API. MobX, Knockout.js, and I think Zastand and a bunch of other libraries, they do very similar thing. They have observables, they have computers, they have effectful computers like useEffect is, and they have things like sort of like useMemo when you, let's say we would have, I can't come up with a good idea somehow. So let's say we would have some sort of tweets. I don't know. A tweet could be a computed. No, it couldn't be. You know what could be a computed? This thing could be a computed. So this thing, threads, depends on the conversation. So if conversation changes, we want to recalculate the thread, and we could actually memoize it. So if this logic would be inside of our component, then we could drop it into a use memo, and that would be an data non-effectful computed. I don't know, why did I start ranting again about this thing? Yeah, hooks are amazing. They're super cool. And I love moving my business logic to custom hooks because a lot of times it will make it easier to test your components. One of the things that are kind of hard to test in React is context. It's just so awkward to test it. It's much more code than regular components. And one of the ways you can mitigate this problem, fix this issue, is you can move all the logic. Actually, I can show you the code.
You have some for
you can move all the logic to the hook, and then your context won't need to be tested. So React TypeScript. manuscript code 02 testing code. So we have a completed project.
So this is from your book, right?
Yeah, it's from my book, but the structure of the book changed recently, so I will have to navigate it manually. I think it's now sort of more like a course structure. We changed the way we work with the books recently.
Mm.
Course code 02 testing completed. C, and we have cart context. This context holds the cart information. So the application I'm talking about here is a small store where you can buy different armor, weapons, and potions. And then you see the cart icon that shows how many items do you have in it. And as we need this information about the items in a bunch of places in our application, we are using context. But look at this. My cart provider doesn't have any logic. It just takes whatever the use cart hook provides and then passes it down. That's it. We don't need to test it anymore. A lot of people skip unit tests for React components anyways, but for some cases like context logic a lot of times is businessy. It's kind of the logic that you want to test. And if we look at the use cart that actually provides all the logic here, it loads the products from the local storage, and then it allows to calculate the total price, add items to the cart, remove items from the cart, clear the cart completely, and then returns the whole thing as an object. We can just cover it in a hook test. And hooks are much easier to test than context. As you can see, the tests are kind of straightforward. If any, there is one thing that we do on mount, and it's loading the data from the local storage. This is where I have it described that specifies the scope. Then I write the test that describes what are we expecting. And we expect that it loads. Why do we have second it here? It shouldn't be here. It loads data from the local storage. Then we have actions, and here I use the rspec convention, where if it's a method, I'm using hash here. Should it be dot? It doesn't really matter. Use whatever convention that you find comfortable or convenient. Just be consistent. So here we test that it adds to the cart, removes to the cart, and it is not that much boilerplate. We just provide the items that are in the cart initially, and then we perform the action add to cart. We add another product, and then we check that the products that are in the cart now, that they match the ones that we expect to be after we've added the product. Same with removing, and same with clearing the cart. We just expect that it's going to be empty.
Awesome. And I linked your book in the chat, and I'll definitely link it also in the description of this YouTube video once it's uploaded. But yeah, awesome. This has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. I appreciate and thank you for accepting to face off with the challenge. So everybody, be sure to check out all of Maksim's work on Twitter and his YouTube channel, where you can find it over at maksimivanov.com. And also definitely check out his book, which I just linked in the chat, which is Full Stack React with Typescript, which you can also find it at newline.co. Next week, we'll have Sid Palace, who will face off against Kubernetes. So Maksim, before we hop off, any last words?
The first chapter is free.
Perfect. But cool.
It was cool. I really liked it.
Yeah. I'm going to see if there's anybody to raid quick. It looks like my friend Alex Trost is on, so I'm going to raid him. But thanks again, Maksim. Thanks everybody who tuned in. And this is Colby signing off.